Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And let me find our place. There we are. Okay. Give me 1 second, and I'm going to share the screen. So one thing that's going to come up, which we need to take into account. They did live, as we realize already, at a time when slavery was something that was an accepted norm. And of course, we need to keep that in mind. And in terms, so just to give you a general overview, so to speak, when it came to figuring out compensatory damage, because slaves were valued, they had specific, there was a market, and they could figure out the value of work, etc., on that basis of the human being in that regard. They used that as a measurement. And I know that that goes contrary to our own sensibilities, but please try to understand the times that they were living in. And I think the idea is that we can extrapolate, is that one has, in order to be fair, that's the issue. I need to ask somebody who is not muted to please mute themselves, because I'm hearing feedback. At any rate, that we would extrapolate from that, since we essentially don't have slavery, but to find ways in which we can estimate on a similar kind of level the value of a person in the various categories. So that's how I would tend to deal with it, and to use saying that here they are using the ways in which they did these things back then, and say such principles, in other words, to take the basic principle and apply it to nowadays. So having said that, I hope you'll be able to appreciate what we're reading in a different kind of way and not judge it too quickly. All right. So here we are. V'chi natsu anashim. If two people are struggling with each other, they're engaged in a struggle with each other. V'nagfu isha hara. So this is plural and says, and they struck a pregnant woman. Hara is a word in Hebrew that we say means pregnant, a pregnant woman. V'yatzu yaladeha, so that her fetus, the child, departs, right? She essentially gives birth at that point. V'lo yeh ason. However, there is no tragedy, is the word ason generally. What it means is that she herself survives. That's what it's saying. Anosh ye'enesh, he shall be fined, ka'asher yashit alav, as is placed upon him.
Sorry, are you saying that the fetus is like it's like dies?
Yes, correct.
Okay, you
Yes,
that
that's
was
the point.
completely clear.
Yes,
Okay.
the child dies, but the woman survives. Okay, so just as the Baal Haisha means the husband of the woman, estimates the Natan Biflilim, and he shall give. Biflilim means according to there's several ways to understand this. Basically, the word palel has to do with judging, right? According to the judges is the way the Aramaic, the Onkelos translates it, al meimar dayanaya. You may recognize the word dayan there, judge, according to the word of the judges. Pelilim could also mean according to a fair estimation, something like that. Okay. So here we are seeing a principle of compensatory damages. And of course, it's a very difficult area of law. At least I think it's a difficult area of law in terms of trying to find equity. And so we're getting into this whole subject here. Let's see here. Let's take a look at the Rashi. So the point is here, it's it's accidental, right? That it happens accidentally, but
May I
nevertheless,
ask you a question, Rabbi? On a miscarriage,
yeah.
does the fetus get a full funeral, or does he not get a full funeral?
Okay, no, there's no full funeral, but the fetus is buried. Okay, it depends on the degree of development of the fetus. So if basically we are looking at a child and we're not just looking at liquids and things like that, then the child is buried, right? But less than that, then I'm not sure exactly how that is taken care of.
You
Right.
know, the parents, I mean, they're
Yeah.
wounded somewhere, either physically, mentally,
Right.
because they lost that child.
Right.
We
And
have to go and help them a little bit. You know, it's not right.
for sure. But again, a lot has to do with to what degree this child is developed. Okay. So like if it's, for example, in the first trimester, I'm not sure exactly all the development of a fetus, but assumedly this is something that is discussed in the halakha, just not here. Here we're talking about damages.
And in
Yes.
this text, we're supposed to assume that this is a husband who strikes his pregnant wife.
No, no.
Any man who strikes any pregnant woman.
Correct.
Okay.
That's why I think it's in the plural here, right? It's simply saying it's okay, again, because of the society and the way the society worked at that particular point, the husband is responsible. Suppose, though, she's a single woman, but she happens, in other words, suppose her husband died, or she was divorced, but turned out to be pregnant.
Or raped.
Yeah, or raped. Raped involves a whole different set of, issues as well.
But
So
it can also cause single motherhood.
of course, of course, of course. But then that would have to be taken care of also. And that is an issue that does come up too, in terms of a woman who's raped. But the point is, when it says her husband, I think what it would be saying is people that would bear responsibility in her family. If she had no one, then again, those sorts of things are dealt with as one starts to explore and uncover the various circumstances that may appear. But we want to start off with basically the simple proposition and the simple case relatively. But I think because it says vinagfu, right? It says they strike. So it could be both of them. They're both involved here, and both of them in that struggle strike a woman who's pregnant, and now her fetus departs. Okay, and they are responsible for that. Okay, so that's the point. And how do they bear that responsibility? So it says if two men or two people are struggling, right? Ze im ze, right? Rashi's going to spell out the circumstance, one with the other. V'nitkaven lahakot et chavero, and the one person intends to strike his fellow. V'hika et haisha, and he wound up striking the woman. This is something that could happen. And we'll see how this goes. Let's keep going and see what he says, because there's an issue that's raised. What if, suppose you try and shoot an arrow at someone and you miss them and you strike someone else and kill them? What's the circumstance? Because there is no, I think the technical term in legal terms is mens rea. There's no intent to kill that other person. So how do you deal with that situation? Because intent becomes very important in applying law. At any rate, without getting into that, let's just keep going on this. I'm just trying to raise the issue. V'nagfu, right? So he said, and they struck. Ein negifa. So he says this term nagfu, ela lashon dechifa. What it means is pushing. It has the meaning essentially of pushing, v'haka'ah, and striking. And he gives examples in Psalms, pen tigof be'evan raglecha, lest your foot strike a stone. So it's striking in some kind of way, right? Another example in Jeremiah, uveterem yitnagfo, and before he, nagfu raglechem, and before your feet strike it, something like that. Another example from Isaiah, ula even negev. So that would be a stumbling stone. So, velo yeh ason. So that there is no tragedy, he says, but isha, with the woman. In other words, she doesn't die as a result of this. Anush ye'enesh. So it's saying he shall surely be fined, or he shall be held accountable, something like that, punished. L'shalem, and this is the nature of the punishment. L'shalem d'mei dvaldut. He has to pay the value of the child, of the birth, leval, to the husband. And he goes on to say, shamin ota, they estimate her, kama haita reuya lihimaker bashuk, how much would she have raised in the market? The slave market is what we're talking about, right? How much would she have been sold in the market? Leha'alot b'damea b'shvil heriona, had she been pregnant. In other words, she would have been more valuable. Lahalot b'damea means to increase her value b'shvil heriona, for the fact that she was pregnant. So as I said, this is, for our taste, this is not tasteful at all, but they're just, what the principle that they're trying to say is that there's several ways of estimating the damages that have to be paid in this particular case. So he says, Anush Yanesh, he's discussing this again, right? And I'm translating it as he will be certainly fined. So yigbu mamon mimenu, meaning they will take money from him. Kamor, so that's anshu ota me'akesef. In Deuteronomy, it says he will be fined 100 pieces of silver. So again, this idea of anosh, which is just, punished, or it could mean simply punished, but what does that mean, right? In other words, specifically, what is the punishment? And what Rashi is doing here is taking this word anosh and showing that it can mean, in this case, fining the person. Ka'asher yashit alav, as shall be placed upon him. So he explains, this is the verse said, the husband. Why is the husband being mentioned here? That is to say that the husband is bringing him before the court, right? So the husband has a responsibility to bring the person who injured his wife to court, lahashit alav, to then place upon the guilty person, onesh al-kach, the fine regarding this. So it's essentially saying this case has to go to court. The Natan Hamakir.
Sorry, I have a question clarifying what they mean by husband, because if this is an enslaved woman
No, she's not enslaved.
She's not.
No. So I'm
Then
glad.
why are you talking about selling her?
We're not. We're talking about trying to figure out a fair value. That's all. So we're saying if she were, not that she is a slave or that she's going to be sold or anything.
So you're saying to determine a fair value, you have to consider that that she could someday be enslaved and have a market value based on a slave trade? Well, why is it mentioning that two Rashis earlier?
Okay, so the reason is that we know that there is a slave trade, okay? We know that there is a market for slaves. It has nothing to do with her being a slave, but we try to evaluate her if in fact she were subjunctive, right? Not saying that she ever will be or has to be or anything like that, but were she in the market, how much would they pay?
Gotcha.
Okay, so I'm so glad you clarified that, Lauren, because there's no suggestion whatsoever that she herself is going to be a slave. They're simply trying to figure a market value here, okay, for the pregnancy. That's all. This isn't taking into account anything else. I'm just saying in this particular case, in other words, what they're doing is they're trying to separate the various issues. In other words, there may be pain and suffering involved. That also requires compensation. So what we're doing is we're breaking up the various components to this particular situation. And the essential component we're talking about is the loss of pregnancy as a result of, and the loss of the fetus as a result of this accident, this unintentional act. And the Torah is just giving a specific case from which we need to derive some general principles. In other words, how do you figure out and that one has to do that, right? That there's actually a sense of loss in the fact that she's no longer pregnant. So is that clearing up the issue here for you?
Yeah, enough.
Okay, all right, okay. So that's what they're saying. In other words, he's giving the one who strikes is giving the value of the pregnancy. I'm going to translate vladut from Yeled Vlad, a child. Biplilim, again, so the language here is not easy language, but he's saying al pi hadayanin, according to how the judges estimate. So
But I'm
ahead.
sorry, the Rashi before that, it
Yes.
does have a plural word. It does seem to talk about plural, like it's more than one fetus, perhaps.
No, I think it's vladut. Okay.
Here it says vladot
Okay, it could
and
be vladot.
fetuses, so
Okay, well, it's talking then about the category, the general category of.
okay.
You follow me?
Yes,
Yeah, not
thank
that
you.
she has more than one fetus. It's just talking about the cat. That's how they're referring to. That's why I was saying vladut, which would be a noun, right? A simple noun, and the concept of it. But vladot could well be that they're correct, and that what we're still simply talking about fetuses as a general category.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. So again, al pi hadayanim. Here's again, here if I'm pointing to the onkelos al meimar dayanaya, right? And I pointed this out before. Okay. So this is a case where she loses the fetus, but she herself is okay. And we're talking now only about the issue of she was pregnant before, she's no longer pregnant. That's what we're talking about. And it's not to exclude any other issues that may involve compensation. But in terms of trying to figure out the amount of compensation, this is one of the things that has to be taken into account. It cannot be ignored, okay? According to the Torah. The im ason yeh, however, if there is in fact a tragedy, meaning if she is killed. Now as a result of this, now again, they're not intending, there's no intent to injure, there's no intent to kill here, but it's happened. V'natata nefesh tachat nefesh. So the Torah says, you shall give a soul in the place of a soul, which is sounding very much as if we're saying, well, this now becomes a capital offense. That is a problem because there's no intent here. Okay, this happened because we know that when a woman loses a child, when she's pregnant, her situation is somewhat more tenuous, and that she could lose her life as a result of this forced birth taking place. So let's take a look at again how we understand this, how we interpret this. The im ason yeh, and he says the point is ba'isha, in the woman, right? V'natata nefesh tachat nefesh. You shall give a soul in the place of a soul. So does that mean? So we'll take a look. And in Sanhedrin, in the tractate Sanhedrin, Rabutenu chokin badavar, it says there's a difference of opinion amongst the rabbis. Yesh omrim nefesh mamash. There are those who say that the person, in fact, this is now becoming a capital case. That there's a level of responsibility. I mean, as I said, this is in some ways problematic from at least how I would look at it, because there was no intent to kill the woman. But on the other hand, she's lost her life. Someone's lost their life as a result of this. But so there's some who say, no, it's this person is now up on capital charges. The Yeshomrim, but there are those who also say Mammon. No, they say no, it still is talking about a financial compensation. Aval lo nefesh mamash, and that the Torah is not speaking about a real life. Shahamit kaven, here's the point. He says how they derive this, and this is something that I was referring to earlier. Shahamit kaven laharog etzeh, because if a person intended to kill so-and-so, let's say person A, right? If they intended to kill person A, v'harag et zeh, but killed accidentally person B, patur mimita, he is exempt from a capital being brought on capital charges, right? Umishalem leyorshav, and he has to compensate, he has to pay the inheritors, right, of the person he killed, damav, his value. Okay, kamor shahaya, and here's how they do it once again, as he was.
I have a couple of questions
Okay,
about that one.
let me finish. Let me just
Sure.
finish the sentence, please. Okay, Keshahunim karbashuk, again saying his value in the market. Okay, go ahead, please.
One question, and you don't have to answer either of these if you think they're off track, but one question is this deals with he intended to kill the guy, but accidentally killed the woman, but it doesn't say he intended to strike him but not kill him. And the forceful blow, which may not have killed the guy, was forceful enough to kill the woman, so he didn't necessarily intend to kill the guy. It doesn't really address that. The other thing is about the word damav as value. I assume that also is what means blood.
It is, but damim also is a word for money.
So it's completely unrelated as far as you know?
Yes, at least in this case. I'm not saying that the words may not have some relationship to each other, okay, in the sense that blood is also allows you to live, and having an income also allows you to live, whether the income is cash or the income is some other kind of form, but it's basically, usually it's referring to cash. It's talking to money is what it's talking about. Damim.
You know, Rabbi, that reminds me of an eye for an eye,
It's
an
coming
ear
up.
for an ear.
That's the
and so
next
forth.
line.
It's verse, Harlan. So if we have time, although I think we're running out of time, then how they deal with that and discuss that it's not literal. It's not to be taken literally. This is a famous passage where they show they do not believe in lex talionis, which is an eye for an eye. Okay, they're very clear about that. There's a whole discussion about it. Anyway,
Well,
Lauren,
there should be compensation, though.
Hold on. Yes, absolutely. You can't just do these things and get away with it. Okay.
What if you pull a guy's eye out that he needs that eye for work or something? You know, that's not right.
Harlan, I'm not going to deal with it now. I'm not.
Okay.
I don't want to go off subject. Let's try and keep
Okay.
Thank you. Lauren, you said you had a second question.
Yeah.
Well, no, the second question was the first comment, which was the part about how it talks about his intention to kill the man and then he accidentally killed the woman, as opposed to his intention to harm the man and he accidentally.
So there's nothing. Okay. So the issue here is that there's no intent to kill necessarily. That's not okay. The second case, Rashi was taking a different situation and saying that's a severe situation, right? Here's the way the logic is going. If in a case, not this case, but in another case, if Reuben plans to kill Shimon, okay, and in the case, in his intent to kill Shimon, he doesn't kill Shimon, he kills Levi by mistake, never had any intent to kill Levi, but he wound up killing Levi. What do you do? And the answer is that Jewish law does not consider that's manslaughter, essentially. That's not, there's no intent to kill there. And likewise, so they're going here where initially there's no intent to kill necessarily at all. They're simply struggling. There's no, killing is not the issue here. Here it's simply struggling. So here's the argument. If in an attempt, in a situation where the intent is to kill and someone else is killed by accident, the person who did that is not held capitally liable. Certainly in a case where there never was an intent to kill to begin with, the person shouldn't be held liable. Okay, you follow the argument. That's basically what Rashi's trying to say here. And that's in support of those people who say there needs to be financial compensation. And not that when the Torah says nefesh tachat nefesh, they're talking about the value of a soul, for the value of a soul. And we're just starting to get into this whole issue of how does one begin to actually work out in a just way, at least in as just a way as possible, how you financially compensate for injury. So we're just getting into that. We are out of time at this point, but that's what the Torah is dealing with right now. So if somebody wants to say anything before I end the recording, that's fine. Otherwise, I'll stop the share and stop the recording in a moment. Okay, let me stop the recording. And